We are approaching Christmas by way of a much-loved Christmas story, A Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens in 1843. It's been on movies, on stage, cartoons, every way you can imagine. Ebenezer Scrooge, whom Dickens calls a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scratching, clutching, covetous old sinner. You hardly have to hear anything more. 2 Sundays ago, we remembered how Jacob Marley, Scrooge's business partner who had been dead for 7 Christmases, came to warn Scrooge that he would be visited by 3 ghosts, sort of a last-ditch opportunity to save his soul. Last Sunday, it was the ghost of Christmas past, and today, we remember how after that ghost, Scrooge heard the bells of the clock chime again. And Scrooge finds himself in the presence of the ghost of Christmas present, who has over 1,800 brothers, 1 for every Christmas. Now, the ghost of Christmas present is sort of a jolly soul. His huge body's filled with mirth, but he has a serious side too, as we'll see. Here he's depicted in the very first version of A Christmas Carol in 1843. So a little close-up there. Here he is again, in a more up-to-date stage production. And here, one of my favorite versions, Carol Kane in Scrooged. Yes, that's Bill Murray. If you haven't seen this one, rent it, download it, something like that. Here again, the ghost of Christmas present, he's very much in touch with the Christmas spirit. And that torch he's carrying, he has an incense that wafts from his torch, has the ability to enhance and sometimes even fill an event or a person with Christmas spirit. Now, the ghost of Christmas present flies with Scrooge first to the home of Bob Cratchit, who is, of course, Scrooge's employee. And Ebenezer discovers there the plight of his employee and his family, that scant resources that Scrooge gives Bob Cratchit by way of a salary. And he also sees Tiny Tim, his son, who has an illness that is advancing, becoming more serious all the time. And Scrooge is moved by this. Spirit, he asks, with an interest, Dickens tells us, with an interest he had never felt before. Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat at the table, replies the ghost, and a crutch without an owner. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. Scrooge goes on to find himself at the home of his nephew. Fred is surprised to discover they're talking about him and his bah humbug attitude, but he's actually honored to discover that Fred defends him in a way. Fred says, I mean to give my Uncle Scrooge the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He lifts a glass to his uncle. A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man. Wherever he is, he wouldn't take it from me, but he may have it nonetheless. To Uncle Scrooge. And Ebenezer is touched by his nephew's loyalty, devotion, maybe even a love that he knows he does not deserve. Then Scrooge and the Spirit go to countless places. Dickens tells us, much they saw, and far they went, and many homes they visited, but always with a happy end. The Spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouses, hospital, and jail, in misery's every refuge, wherever vain men had not kept the Spirit out, the ghost of Christmas present left his blessing and taught Scrooge his presence and his precepts. Everywhere they go, there's Christmas. Dicken tells us. And thus, everywhere there is Christ. I want to confess to you that in my younger days, this was not the God I wanted. I wanted a universal God, a God who spoke to everyone at all times and in all places. A genuine revelation of God would do that, I thought. Maybe written in the sky or nowadays on every screen. I mean, how on earth could the God who spins the planets, who whirls the galaxies, who sends electrons whizzing everywhere, how could that God have come to a peasant family in an obscure village in Palestine 2,000 years ago? That didn't make any sense at all. How could a universal God be so particular? But that is the God we have. Luke tells the Christmas story, begins it this way. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, and all went to their own town to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. I confess to you, this just sort of didn't work for me. The Jesus story couldn't be universal because it was so particular. It couldn't speak to everyone because it was so specific. It just didn't make any sense to me at all until it did. Until it did. Until I realized that love is only real when it's particular, when it's specific, when it has someone's name on it. Ebenezer Scrooge learns compassion only when things get particular, because the particular is the universal. The personal is the universal. When Scrooge hears about abandoned children, nothing much happens. But when the ghost of Christmas past takes him to see himself as an 8-year-old boy, the only one left in that boarding school, all alone on Christmas Day, Scrooge sees an abandoned child himself, and he learns compassion. When Scrooge is asked to give to the poor, he waves it off. But when he sees Tiny Tim, sick and getting sicker, with no resources because of the tiny salary he, Scrooge, pays to Tiny Tim's father, it gets personal. Scrooge actually feels something he hasn't felt before, compassion. And it's after the compassion gets personal for Scrooge, then the ghost takes him to all these other places, to other particular places, to sick beds and jails and ships on the sea and lighthouses, to particular places at particular times. And Scrooge eventually, we'll see in the story, he's able to make the jump that a spiritual person makes when he realizes that when compassion and love are particular and specific for one, then you know that compassion and love are also particular to all. It's one thing to say everyone is a child of God. It's true, completely. I believe it, and it's fine to say so, but it's abstract, it's theoretical. It needs some flesh and bone. So let's give it some flesh and bone. When you are holding a baby, whether it's your child or someone else's child, and they clench your little finger in their tiny fist, and you look at their tiny, tiny fingers, and the even tinier fingernails, and she's looking up at you with such trust, such complete trust. And you start talking that universal language that's mostly vowels. because vowels are softer and gentler and just lovelier. Whether it's your baby or someone else's, you know this is a child of God that you're holding. This child, this one in your arms at that very moment. It's personal then. And then, if you're on your best game, then you realize that the particular is the universal. And because this child in your arms is a child of God, there can be no doubt that every child is a child of God. The neighbor child who leaves his bike in your yard all the time. The child of the Syrian refugee that you see on the newscast. The child who grows up in wealth, the child who grows up in poverty, the child of your estranged brother, and even your estranged brother. They're all children of God. Because any one child reveals the truth for all. So the ghost of Christmas Present takes Scrooge on a journey, and everywhere they go, they find Christmas. Everywhere they go, they find Christ. I don't think it's a stretch of Dickens at all to say that this world is not really haunted so much by three ghosts of Christmas time as it is haunted by Christ. The Christ who is everywhere to the eyes who see him. The living Christ who haunts a lighthouse and a hospital. Christ who haunts the home of Bob Cratchit. Christ who haunts Scrooge everywhere, it turns out, everywhere he goes. And while Scrooge experiences it sometimes as a haunting of a bit of terror, deeper still, it's really a haunting of grace. It was a particular time that Christ showed up when the Emperor Augustus called for a census. The story tells us that it wasn't everyone at once that Christ came, but to Joseph, a descendant of David, Joseph who lived in Nazareth, and to Mary, his fiancée. They're on their way to Bethlehem, another place we would never have heard of, but for this story. Bethlehem, where they will lay eyes for the very first time on their very own child of God, whom they would have loved just as much, I'm sure, if the angels had never said a word to them. Because holding little Jesus in their arms would be more than enough for the both of them. Now, if Christ showed up in the first century in that little hill town in a backwater nation to a humble father and mother, well, that makes it possible, maybe even likely, that Christ will show up in your time, in your places. Maybe on a Wednesday, on a cool afternoon in December. Maybe on a street corner in Carlsbad, or an office cubicle in Encinitas, or a playground in San Marcos, or the hallway of La Costa Canyon High School. It's all the more likely that Christ will show up to you in a particular moment, in a particular place. Because that's how the universal Christ shows up. Not all at once to everyone, but here and there, and now and then, to you and to me. Thanks be to God.